Shalom, everyone. Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you today. I think most of you know me, but my name is Moshe. I'm the Vice President for Public Affairs, Development, and Alumni at Tel Aviv University. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, trying to be optimistic in this current event. The world is a little bit going to different places, but here in Tel Aviv University, as we have um, a lot to say, we are trying to keep optimistic in front of this future. And today we decided to bring together with you, our friends around the world, two experts on the current event. It's not a secret that the Middle East is bubbling and it's on fire, literally. And we, because we have really amazing experts in the university on so many different fronts, so we decided to have two of the best ones that will discuss with us about the current event in Syria, and will share with us some of the knowledge that they're holding. Hopefully, we'll be able also to answer some questions afterwards. I will not end, like every time with the prayers of the safe return of all the hostages. There are still have 100 hostages in Gaza that we are praying every day for their return, safe returns. And we are praying for all the soldiers and all our brave women and men that are in the front. So now, with no further ado, I would like to present our first guest, which is Dr. Brandon Friedman. Brandon is a director in the research center Moshe Dayan, one of the top research centers in the world on the Middle East, and of course, you'll hear from him. Brandon is also managing director of the Dayan Center journal Bustan, and of course, the Middle East Book Review. His research during the past 3 years has focused on primarily areas on different in Saudi Arabia, historic perspective, on regional politics since the Arab Spring, and also on China's increased engagement in the Middle East. So I'm sure we'll be able to hear a very interesting thing from Brandon that will enlighten us and try to solve some of this enigma, which is called the Middle East, or Syria in this case. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope to see you in Israel soon and safer and quieter times. So, Brandon, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you, Amos. And on behalf of the Moshe Dayan Center and its director, Dr. Amos Nadan, I'd like to thank the university, Anat Yitzchaki, Yael Regev, and her staff for organizing and hosting this event. And my thanks to all of you for making time to join us today from wherever you may be for this special briefing. Dr. Joe Parker, who'll be joining us shortly, is the real Syrian specialist at the center. And in a few minutes, he'll walk you through the last 2 weeks' developments. But before he does, I just want to briefly set the stage with a few introductory remarks about the Syrian wars. But before I do, I want to say a word about the Moshe Dayan Center. The Moshe Dayan Center is the oldest Middle East-focused research institute in Israel. It was founded in the early 1960s by Professor Shimon Shamir. Its leadership has been distinguished and held distinguished positions both at the university and in the diplomatic sphere, and include people like Professor Itamar Rabinovich, Professor Eyal Zisser, Professor Asher Susser, Professor Uzi Rabi, and others. What we do at the Moshe Dayan Center is interpret the past to understand the present in order to better manage the future. We're historians who look to the past to help us grapple with the uncertainty and change of today's world. The Syrian war started in 2011 and killed more than 600,000 people, displaced more than 12 million, and created more than 5 million refugees outside of Syria. And these numbers don't even begin to do justice to the depths of human suffering that the Syrians experienced over the last 13 plus years. The war began as an uprising in the spring of 2011, evolved into a civil war, but is best understood as 5 interlocking conflicts. First, it's been a civil war between the Assad regime and its backers, primarily Iran, Hezbollah, Russia on one side, and Syria's Sunni majority and Sunni opposition groups, which became dominated by jihadi orientation in 2013. The second conflict has been a war between the various different jihadi groups, whether it's the current HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group that overthrew Assad, or Al-Qaeda, or the Islamic State, which the world became familiar with between 2014 and 2019. The third part of the Syrian war was a war between the US-led coalition and the Syrian Kurds, their partners on the ground, against the Islamic State, both in Syria and Iraq, which began really in 2014, and the US declared victory in 2019. The fourth component of the Syrian war is a war between Turkey, on one hand, which between 2016 and 2019 invaded and occupied large portions of northern Syria, and the Syrian Kurds that today occupy large portions of central and eastern Syria. And the fifth dimension of the Syrian war is a war that many of us know here in Israel, a war between, on one hand, Israel and the United States on one side, and Iran on the other in Syria. The HTS offensive, which was really a lightning advance that started about 10 days to 2 weeks ago, was a strategic earthquake. It toppled 54 years of Assad rule in Syria. It shattered Iran's land bridge extending from Tehran across Iraq and Syria to Lebanon in support of Hezbollah and what Iran called its forward defense. It weakened Russia's foothold in Syria and allowed Israel to seize the high ground of Mount Hermon in Syria known as Jabal al-Sheikh, and to destroy Assad's Syrian Arab army's military hardware and chemical weapons and precision missiles infrastructure. After decades of Iranian patronage, Syria's victors today are backed by Turkey and Qatar. And tens of thousands of Islamic State fighters and their families are held in central Syria by Kurdish-led militias backed by the United States, who now face a renewed assault by Turkey's Syrian National Army. In other words, what's happened is the core conflict, the Syrian civil war to oust Bashar al-Assad, is over. But the wars in Syria, or as some might refer to it, the struggle for Syria, continues. There are several questions that this raises, and I think they're all worthy of discussion. Can we expect that the new Trump administration in the United States will continue to support the Syrian Defense Forces, which are the Kurdish-led militias that hold large chunks of Syrian territory? Are Russia and Iran really gone for good from Syria, or have they just temporarily withdrawn and are biding their time? Can we expect to see the Islamic State rear its head again in Syria, what many around the world fear as an Islamic State comeback? Will events in Syria destabilize Iraq and Lebanon? And finally, will Syria inspire a Muslim Brotherhood revival beyond Syria's borders? And these are just beginning to touch on some of the questions the past 2 weeks have raised. There are even more complex developments when we begin to look and delve into the domestic situation in Syria. And for that reason, we've invited one of our colleagues, Dr. Joel Parker, to brief you on the evolution of the Syrian civil war, the core conflict that ultimately ended with the Assad regime ousted and the dawn of a new era in Syria. If I can, I'd like to turn the floor over to Joel Parker to present to you his take on the Syrian civil war. I think when you look at the Syrian civil war, it really started with an uprising in Daraa, which is in southwest Syria. And one of the key issues that's being raised right now is whether the new regime in Syria can protect Syria's minorities. And for Israel, this is an interesting issue because there's a large Druze minority that lives in the Haran region of the southwest corner of Syria, across the border from the Golan Heights. This Druze community has relatives who live in Israel, and many of them feel vulnerable, given that the new HTS government has a Salafi jihadi perspective. They're not quite sure what to expect in terms of how this new regime will treat or relate to the Druze minority, which is considered a heterodox offshoot of Islam, and certainly would be considered heretical by the Salafi jihadi ideology. So one key question moving forward is whether some of the minorities in Syria, whether they're Druze in the southwest, Ismailis, Christians, will be welcomed and included in the new Syrian government, or by the new Syrian government. Another major issue moving forward is how this government will treat the Alawi minority, which makes 10 to 12% of the Syrian population. It's the Alawi minority that gave Syria Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez al-Assad, and they live along the coast of Syria and are basically being held accountable for the crimes of the Assad regime. And so there's some concern in the Alawi community that there will be punishment meted out. Hi, Joel. How are you?
Hi, good. Sorry,
Welcome.
interrupts you. I'm enjoying hearing
no,
you.
it's okay. I was setting the stage for you, really. After some brief introductory remarks, let me turn it over to you, and you can go ahead and start your PowerPoint, please.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that. It's good to be here, and I appreciate your introduction, Brandon. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It took me a minute. I would like to share the PowerPoint screen if possible. I'm going to ask the IT to put up the PowerPoint here on the screen, if that's okay. Just 1 second. We're in a really amazing period, as Brandon has been explaining. This is something that's shaking the whole region, the Middle East in particular. But I think we're seeing profound change here that could impact global politics. But in a minute, right now, I want to zoom in on the Syrian angle and see and let you know here what's going on. So what we're seeing here, just to show you, is a major guerrilla warfare breakthrough that's managed to topple a 54-year-old dynasty, the Assad dynasty. And what we have is a lot of concerns going forward, but first of all, we're trying to process exactly what happened. And I think that's what we need to do first. So just the next slide here. If I can go to the next slide, I'll show you. What I have is just a very short outline of what I think happened to the Assad regime. Essentially, what we see here is a regime that was designed as a socialist regime. It was allied with the Eastern Bloc, but unlike other countries, say Romania or Poland, it didn't change after 1989. It continued on with this cult of the personality, namely the Assad regime. And Hafez al-Assad was in power from 1970 onwards. And then we had Bashar al-Assad, his son, holding on to the reins. But in the last 10 years, 12 years, we've seen a major decline in the economy. And that had a deep, profound effect on the army and its morale. So in addition to this sort of crumbling socialist architecture, you see the economy is no longer able to even provide adequate incentive for soldiers to fight. And so I would argue that the Syrian army was actually the weak link in the fall of Assad. And in addition to that, of course, we all know the allies of Assad, which we probably know even better than the Syrian regime, Iran and Russia in particular, were also facing tremendous challenges to hold up their own side. And in about 2013, the Iranians had come in to help prop up the Assad regime against the rebellion. And they were very effective. They were very helpful, particularly with Hezbollah coming in to help to strengthen the Syrian regime. And then in 2015, as we know, Russia officially came in with its air force and essentially pushed the rebels into corners of the Syrian state. And I'll show you some maps in a few minutes. What happened was the Russians, because of the Ukraine war and other reasons, decided not to bail Assad out this time. And Iran, in addition to being weakened by domestic economic issues and, of course, the support it's had for Hezbollah that has proven a tremendous failure because of the Israeli bombings and the attacks, the beeper attacks, etc. Iran grew increasingly frustrated with Bashar al-Assad for failing to actually stop the Israeli government from attacking the Iranian bases in Syria. And numerous times over the last year, as well as really for the last decade, Israel has gone in and attacked specific facilities in Syria. And I think Iran reached a point at which it was kind of like, we're invested so heavily in the Assad regime, but why? And I don't want to read too much into this because I don't have unclassified information. I don't have any more information than you can get on the internet or from talking to specialists. But I will say that it seems like the Iranian support for the Assad regime weakened in recent months. And on top of that, these radical jihadi groups and Turkish-backed rebels managed to form a united front. Now, how long that unity will hold in the future, we don't know. But for now, they managed to essentially, through their dislike for the Assad regime, hold together enough to break through Assad regime lines and essentially drive into the Syrian state. But what they did, which was, I think, really fascinating, in addition to having new technology and support from Qatar and Turkey, what they did was they managed to convince the civilian populations of the cities that they entered into, Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and then finally Damascus. They convinced the civilian populations that they were not there to carry out revenge, that despite the bearded faces, they were not there to implement Sharia law from day one. Ask again in a year from now, I don't know. But for the present time, there were almost no incidents reported of anywhere in Syria of reprisal attacks, revenge attacks, sectarian motivated attacks against minorities. The rebels essentially came in and took off their hats as gentlemen, bowed down, and the civilians said, well, since you're here, might as well stay. And that's I think, a real key factor to the success of the rebellion, is that they came in with very little bloodshed relatively. So the next slide, I'll just have a look at that. What we see now is the immediate concerns for the Syrian regime, or for the new Syrian government. Now, assuming that this new Syrian government lasts, we're at a very young stage. This is like a newborn, very fragile. Anything could happen. We could see chaos, but even assuming the regime stays in power, they're going to have to dismantle the things they don't like about the Assad regime, while at the same time rebuild a new welfare system, because the Syrian state, as I mentioned, was a socialist democracy, or theoretically social democracy, but not very democratic, more socialist, based on patronage and distribution of wealth. And so at the same time, I think that the new government will be careful not to completely demolish that. And in fact, they're learning, interestingly, from some of the de-Baathification techniques that happened in Iraq after the US-led invasion in 2003, that turned out to really have hollowed out the bureaucracy almost too much, to where it became difficult to rebuild things for a period of time. Now, there could be instability, so let's just keep that on the back burner for a second. Who's going to be possibly challenging the leadership? We don't really know. We actually don't really know if this leadership that's in power will survive. But let's look into who's in the government right now. One thing that's important to note, two important things to note here, are that we are concerned that more extreme groups, now granted the current government has extremists in it, we're worried that more extreme groups like ISIS could come back, just because if there's a power vacuum or somebody's not looking, they can regroup and reorganize. But we don't know yet that that's happening. Another thing that's really concerning, I think, to the international community is the fact that the transition of government is happening in a completely outside of the international framework that was set up over the years during negotiations, careful and tedious negotiations in Geneva and then later in Astana. We had international negotiations trying to envision a potential transition from Assad to a new government. Assad never wanted to let go of the reins, So that never happened. But essentially now we've destroyed the whole system, and the new government is plowing ahead with no international oversight that we can see. Next slide. If we can move on to the next slide there. Just quickly, I'll go over you, and I've mentioned this. The Syrian regime was based on kind of a patronage system of coercion, forced in the recent years during the civil war, forced conscription. But over the years, basically, Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad played with the idea of maybe going towards the west, maybe going towards the east, and then kind of settling on what they considered a Chinese model of authoritarian politics with a more open economy. Now, that doesn't really work very well for most governments, especially if you don't really have the economic engine to make that work. And so over time, of course, as we know in the last 12 years, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah specifically helped prop up the Syrian regime. And in fact, the Syrian regime became very dependent on the sale of drugs and the production of drugs. And Hezbollah was also important in helping to distribute and manufacture those drugs. We don't even know the full extent of it yet. The rebels are actually uncovering massive factories near Damascus right now where they were producing a drug called Captagon, extremely addictive and extremely popular, also very cheap. It was becoming one of the main sources of income for the top strata of the Syrian government. And so while Assad and his family were getting rich from drug money, basically like a cartel, the rest of the population was suffering on the streets with their bare basic needs met. So that, I think, is something we need to understand, the trajectory of this failure. And if we can go forward to the next slide. I just want to mention briefly, and you know this, you probably, I'm talking to an educated group here. You all know that in 2011, after the Arab Spring, Syria moved to have a popular uprising. Initially, it was nonviolent, at least from the civilian side, but the regime brutally suppressed it, far more brutally, actually, than we saw in Egypt or Tunisia. But we did see some brutality in Libya before the French, British, and US-led kind of rebellion in Libya, which didn't actually turn out so well. That the future will tell us where that's going to go. But in Syria, the regime fought back, and again, over time, with allies, managed to fight against a Turkish and mostly Arab-backed rebellion. Now, over time, it's very complicated, but over time, during the rebellion, Islamic movements did gain more and more traction. And there's lots of ideas explaining why that was. One of the ideas is just that there were individual Islamists who donated lots of money and weapons to the rebellion, and their conditions for receiving that money and those weapons was that the groups they donated to had to demonstrate, at least externally, that they were committed to Islamist values. Over time, I think those values became internalized in certain groups. Certain groups seem to be very serious about embracing a type of jihadi Islamist ideology. And those groups over time did quite well on the battlefield, I think partly because of their cohesive ideology. So I think that was one of the key things that led to a major, that led to the rebels staying strong while the regime was getting weaker and weaker. Another thing to take to consider is the northwestern side of Syria, which here is in yellow, was mostly controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was a US-backed organization, is a US-backed organization. They continue to exist, and many of the officer class are Kurdish and represent the Kurdish minority, which is concentrated in the northeast of Syria. And it remains to be seen what exactly is going to happen with this group, because they continue to exist and they have US backing. I think that the current government in Damascus is definitely reluctant to directly go against them. Next slide, please. So just to wrap things up again, go over really what happened on the battlefield. This Venn diagram might be helpful. The lack of foreign close air support combined with economic stagnation in the regime territory, and what happened was the largely civilian government in the opposition territory increasingly became more and more cohesive and competent. Actually, the years of living in rebellion and having frozen front lines led to the rebel side becoming more and more like a functioning state. And what they created was really more and more of a proper army, less and less of a band of ragtag rebels. And the regime was faced with a serious opposition from really a very cohesive, very well-armed, and drone-producing rebellion. Next slide, please. So one of the studies that I saw that was quite fascinating, just to give you a kind of data-driven analysis of the Syrian regime, is that over the course of the Syrian civil war, we can look from, not everybody knew, it was difficult to aggregate the data and figure out what was really happening on the whole. One of the studies that showed, in addition to the numbers we have of 600,000 people being killed at least, and over 6 million people being refugees, which millions of more were also internally displaced, we have a satellite image study that was done in the beginning of the war that showed an 80% decrease in nighttime light emissions. Now, what that means is that because of the urban warfare, many of the cities in Syria, the ones I just mentioned a few minutes ago, Hama, Homs, Aleppo, Damascus, had basically gone dark because of urban warfare. And that was really the problem with the first 4 or 5 years of warfare, was that it was concentrated in the cities in many cases, and it created enormous destruction. Now, on the next slide, I'll show you, if you want to move, that in recent years, because of the frozen conflict lines, what you saw was a kind of rebound. Around 2018, 2019, you started to see that all across Syria, the different groups who had managed to control and consolidate control over different areas, the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast, the Syrian rebels in the northwest, and the regime in the south, all started kind of slowly rebuilding their economies, at least from what we can tell from satellite imagery. Now, what's interesting is that in the last 4 years or so, the opposition-held areas have continuously increased the amount of light that you can see from the sky at night from their areas, which means that in a basic, crude sense, their economies were getting better. Now, the SDF would have also continued to improve the northeast, but they've had some trouble with Turkey, and there's a kind of a Kurdish nationalist movement going on there that Turkey really doesn't like. And so Turkey has actually been involved in essentially halting the growth that we might have seen in the northeast. Whereas regime-held areas, because of liquidity crisis in Lebanon and other factors, saw a decrease in the last 4 years of light emissions over the entire south of Syria. That includes Aleppo, Damascus, and all of the coastal areas of Latakia, where the regime hardcore base was supposedly living. So we get an idea that the regime was just getting weaker and weaker from an economic perspective, becoming more and more dependent on drugs and illicit sales, while the opposition areas were trying to rebuild their lives. And I think that is a key component to seeing that, when the opposition came in, people were not so opposed to it. Next slide, please. You can just see some numbers here. I won't dwell on this too much, but over the last 12 years, there's been an 83% decline in the overall economy of Syria. The oil production of Syria, which was never huge, has gone down to a fourth of what it was before the civil war. And all of that, or 90% of that oil production, is now in SDF-held territory. So that's the American-backed coalition that's led by Kurdish militias and the Arab tribal forces in the northeast control all of Syria's oil production, which is again only a fourth of what it was at the beginning of the civil war, showing you that the overall Syrian economy is very, very basic right now, at a very low point. That creates essentially problems going forward, how to rebuild from where it is. It's not going to be simple. Next slide, please. So this is a map, by the way, if you look at the right-hand side, before I go into my question on the left, which is who is this HTS group? You'll see on the map, I've mentioned the northeastern side, which includes Hasaka and Raqqa. It's the area where the SDF is in control. And now the rebels essentially control all of where the regime held, including also the orange areas and the light blue and dark blue areas, and the pink area is kind of a US declared deconfliction zone. It's essentially controlled by the rebels with a few American soldiers there who aren't actually in conflict with the rebels at the present moment. So we see that really about 2/3 of Syria and the vast majority of its population are essentially under rebel control right now. This is important to understand, and when you look at it, this Hayat Tahrir al-Shams was originally an offshoot of al-Qaeda in Syria. So that's an important fact to know. I think a lot of people are mentioning that this group has roots in very serious terrorism. Now, this is a key question going forward. Where is it going to go from here? Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the head of HTS, is about 42 years old. He was born in Riyadh. His family originally comes from the Golan Heights, hence the name al-Julani. And he was radicalized in the Second Intifada. So he definitely identifies with the Palestinian cause as well, if you want to keep that in mind. And as soon as during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, he also decided to go fight against the US-led forces in Iraq and joined Al-Qaeda for Iraq. I think I mixed up the words there. AQI, as it's called. But he was captured by US forces. It's unclear how he was captured. Maybe that will eventually be revealed. It is known that he spent 5 years in different prisons, including the infamous Abu Ghraib. And when he was released, he briefly joined up with the head of the Islamic State before going into Syria to form the branch of Al-Qaeda called the Al-Nusra Front. Next slide, please. So I want to get to questions and answers, but I do want to just kind of mention one thing that maybe you haven't heard too much about. HTS, and you can see this guy, Abu Hassan al-Hamwi, he's about 40 years old. Like many of the senior commanders, these guys have been involved in guerrilla fighting for the last 12 years or so. And some of them, again, like al-Julani, since the early 2000s, the last 20 years. These are hardened warriors. They know what they're doing. They have serious equipment. It's not cheap. And they've also learned interesting techniques. In fact, there's the Washington Post noted that there may have been Ukrainian intelligence coming into the HTS areas of Idlib, which is northeastern Syria, in the last few months, trying to help improve their drone capabilities. And already as early as 2019, HTS was learned how to modify drones and use them to attack forward positions. They use 3D printing, which is really something quite phenomenal, quite, I would say, frightening on some levels, just because 3D printing is so, to use the word democratic, it's so decentralized. Anyone with a 3D printer and some blueprints and special programs can print anything from guns to drones. I mean, usually the durability of the actual 3D printed drones is not that high. So they try to use 3D printed parts to improve on commercially available drones. And this is not my field of expertise, but I do know that they were able to carry out an extremely deadly attack against the Homs military base just over a year ago, killing over 100 people, and some people say as many as 200 people. The Syrian regime kept it kind of secret, but we saw videos that were absolutely horrifying, to put it mildly, of drones coming in in a graduation ceremony and just wiping out officers and entire groups of people. So we know these guys are capable of carrying out incredibly deadly attacks. Again, that's not a contradiction with my previous claim that when they came into the cities, they've decided that their policy was not to carry out revenge attacks. So the next slide, and we're getting to the end, I just want to try and raise some concerns here as we move forward, trying to think about what should the international community do with these guys. We know that their background is in terror, but we also want to see what they're doing now, because if they're in power in Syria, we have to be very careful. I think of the example of Fidel Castro in 1958-59 when he came to power, very similar in a sense that he brought a guerrilla warfare movement up against an unpopular leader, and the people, at least outwardly, seemed to support him when he eventually did succeed in his guerrilla warfare movement against the Batista government. And by the way, American and Western media was pretty open and tolerant to Fidel Castro in those early days. And most of the lip service he gave was that I want to have democracy, the people are behind me, I'm a good leader, I'm going to be the good guy. And over time, what happened was the laws changed as the ideology took root, and suddenly the tone of the international community changed sharply. And we could see something similar to happening in Syria. And the reaction is key. If we don't reorient ourselves to understand, I think, better where this government is going and quickly understand that, we might overreact, which is not good, or we might be unprepared for changes to come. And I think those are two kind of sides of the coin. We can raise that in question and answer. We are concerned that their ideology could spread to Muslims around the world, like in Europe, and inspire groups to carry out even potentially terrorist attacks. But that's too far, that's too theoretical right now. At the moment, what we're seeing is a Syrian government that is, in fact, apparently, ostensibly, from all practical purposes, as far as we can see with our eyes, supported by the vast majority of the public. And that is something we clearly see. Where it's going, we don't know. We have to watch very carefully. And I think I'm going to stop with that, because we can ask the questions about what Israel should do, whether Israel should be worried about Turkish backing, Qatari backing. These are all questions that we just don't know the answers to, but I would be happy to hear your questions and understand where your concerns are.
Joel, it looks like we have a few questions already in the chat box. So we'd encourage you, if you have additional questions, to go ahead and enter them in, and we'll try to address them as we see them. Joel, maybe I'll start in, if I can. There's a question here about Turkey establishing a protectorate. And I would just say my impression is that Turkey's already established a protectorate for quite a number of years now in northern Syria. And really, HTS, the group that seized power, was under the protection of the Turkish military for many years. Russia and Iran and the Assad regime wanted to move on Idlib province, which was the home of HTS for years. And what stopped them was Turkey. And so I think now that Turkey, I would say now that Turkey has sort of unconstrained by Russian and Iranian power, at least for the time being, it certainly seems that way. It's fair to say that whatever HTS succeeds in establishing in terms of sovereignty in Syria will be a de facto Turkey protectorate. So we're going to see the territory that Turkey's occupied in northern Syria expand. And for years now, the areas in northern Syria have been using Turkish currency, have been relying on Turkish infrastructure for their basic government services. And I would imagine, given that in recent days, we've seen the head of Turkish intelligence and the Turkish foreign minister in Syria, that relationship is only going to continue to grow. I've sort of said that my impression is, and this is an oversimplification, but I think there's a kernel of truth to it, is that if Syria has been the beneficiary of Iranian and Russian patronage now for more than a decade, it's now the beneficiary of Turkish patronage under new leadership.
Okay, I 100% agree. I think one thing that I saw in social media was a push from within Turkey. I saw this in Turkish media, that they would like to see the new Syrian regime create a party that's almost identical in ideological sense to the AKP, the Erdogan's party. They think that's a great model to have, the idea of an Islamist democratic party. For them, the best model for that is, in fact, of course, the Turkish model. So we'll see that going forward. I don't know. Another question we have here is, will the Syrian development threaten Jordan? And I appreciate that question. I think that we do see some threats. Again, it's a little bit of an unknown box here, a black box, how much of a threat we see. I know that the Muslim Brotherhood Party in Jordan didn't do very well in the parliamentary elections. Now, assuming it was fair, that's an indication that there's not a groundswell of support for Islamist parties in Jordan. But I think, and another thing that helps Jordan is that the king and the regime in Jordan is not nearly as brutal as we saw in Syria. And I think that those two factors, the fact that there's not a huge Islamist movement in Jordan, and the fact that the king is a little bit more moderate, means it could be protected for at least the near future from, spillover effect.
If I could, maybe there's a question here about Turkey and Syrian refugees. I just want to briefly address that, and then we'll also address the question about the Syrian Druze. I know, Joel, you probably have a few things to say about that, but I think I see Turkey as having two core interests in Syria right now, in and above continuing to serve as a patron to HTS. One core interest is rolling back the Kurdish control of eastern and central Syria. And so we've already seen over the last 2 weeks that Turkish air power and the Syrian National Army, which is a group of rebels supported actively by Turkey, conduct assaults on Kurdish-controlled areas in Syria. So there's a war underway right now. It's receiving some coverage, but I think everyone is focused on what happened with HTS and the fall of the Assad regime, and that issue is getting a little bit of short shrift. The other core interest that Turkey has in Syria is resettling the 3 million plus Syrian refugees who Turkey has provided refuge for since the Syrian civil war began. This has become a serious political issue in Turkey, one that has had an impact on the last election this past year in Turkey. So Turkey would very much like to repatriate the Syrian as many of the Syrian refugees living in Turkey as it can to Syria. The question is, where are they going to go? Will they be allowed to return to their homes? There's some sense that Turkey may try to repatriate a certain number of those Syrian Arab refugees to lands that have been inhabited by Kurds over the last few decades. And so the issue of Syria's desire to roll back Kurdish control in Syria, along with Turkey's desire to return the refugees, I think are two overlapping issues that we're going to see Turkey push very hard on in the near term.
Right. Yeah, and I think several questions deal with the Turkish issue, and I think that is a key question that we have. My opinion is that there's some movement to try and bring in Barzani of Iraq as a mediator. I've seen that he already has kind of made gestures both towards Turkey and towards Damascus as a potential mediator. And you know that the northern Iraqi Kurdish, kind of government there has semi-autonomy. And at the same time, they've managed to create a pretty good relationship for the most part with Ankara. And that could be interesting to see if the Kurds could have a mediator to perhaps tone down the conflict to where it wouldn't be necessarily a violent conflict between HTS Damascus and the Northeast. That is something, it would probably come out in Turkey's favor in the sense that they would probably end up being the downgrading the Kurdish fighters there in the Northeast somehow, perhaps voluntarily. That would be the ideal situation. We don't know yet, but maybe you have a question you want to look at there, Brendan.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions asking about the Druze, and it's something that I mentioned, Joel, right before you began your presentation, that the Druze, I have heard on social media and seen videos suggesting that Druze leadership in southwest Syria feels vulnerable. They're concerned about the nature of sort of the Salafi jihadi ideology that HTS has embraced, and are concerned perhaps that that ideology may target them as a minority, a heterodox Muslim offshoot. And I think that there is some concern, and obviously their cousins live in the Israeli Golan, and therefore there is a internal lobby in Israel that is speaking up on their behalf. But I would say that this issue isn't necessarily new. We heard and saw it repeatedly during the course of the Syrian war, the Syrian civil war, when Druze leadership on the Golan lobbied the Israeli government to do more to protect the Druze on the Syrian side of the Golan. So this is an issue Israel's been dealing with now for many years. In terms of what Israel may or may not do, I think it's going to be very careful. Israel seemed reluctant over the years to interfere. It wasn't quite clear if the Druze spoke with one voice when they said they wanted Israeli protection. So my sense is that Israel is going to wait and see and tread very carefully when it comes to extending protection to parties on the Syrian side of the border.
Yeah, I agree. I think it also Israel has to be careful not to do things too overtly and in everybody's face, because overt Israeli protection, like sending in a tank or something or a division, would, I think, arouse animosity and perhaps create conflict. Covert communication might be a prudent option just to kind of maintain some ties, oral communication ties, and watch the situation very closely. I think that may have even been the point that the Druze were trying to send to Israel, was that keep an eye on us for now. Let's keep the line open. Not necessarily asking to change the status quo, but let's be in touch kind of message.
I think there's a question asking whether HTS or the Syrian rebels will confront Israeli forces now that Israel's seized the high ground on Mount Hermon and extended into Syrian territory. I've seen conflicting reports on this, Joel. Feel free to chime in on this issue, but the comments that were coming out of Jolani is that HTS is focused inwardly in sort of trying to govern, establish sovereignty, expel Iranian influence and occupation, extend control of the government over all sovereign Syrian territory, as much of it as possible. So I don't necessarily see HTS and the rebels turning to Israel on Mount Hermon as a first order of business or even top 10. And I think Israel is there because controlling Mount Hermon allows Israel to have early warnings of precision missiles and drones, which have threatened Israeli territory, particularly during the war with Lebanon, but not just. And so I think that for Israel, it's a wait and see. I think the rebels aren't particularly keen after seeing what Israel was able to do to Hezbollah in Lebanon. I don't think the rebels are particularly keen to pick a fight with Israel at this stage. So I would say in the short term, right now it looks like HTS is focused more inward and less focused on Israel. But obviously that can change.
Right, and I think one point, I know we're coming, towards the end. One point I wanted to kind of mention that I think is important to mention about the Israeli intelligence in Syria is that this new government and the new, at least it could be temporary, but the newfound freedom that we're seeing from the Syrian civilian population is actually probably helpful overall to Israel in the one sense that we have more information. It's more public. There's things going on that are going up to Twitter or Telegram or YouTube like right away, whereas the previous regime, because of its nature, tried to keep a lot under wraps, quiet. We know they were keeping prisoners, massive numbers of prisoners in prisons, and presumably torturing them. All this was happening under the radar. Now, so much of what's happening is out there. I think that gives us quite a lot more of a sense, a depth of what's going on in Syria, which in itself, to me, is a positive thing for Syrians, but it's also a positive thing from a maybe just understanding what's going on perspective.
I think we're running out of time, so I just want to try to address a couple of questions here and then wrap things up. First of all, thank you again to everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and it's an honor to be able to brief you on these recent developments. I think that in terms of the international community, whether it's the United States and the new Trump administration or international institutions figuring out what their future policy is, I think it's still fairly early. I think they're trying to figure out themselves how to approach HTS. And I think that we're all going to be watching carefully to see how things evolve. I think that how HTS conducts itself and how it chooses to govern is going to, in large part, dictate the responses of international institutions, whether it's the UN or NATO or the United States. And so I think we're in a mode where we're all going to be watching and waiting to see what happens. But I think seeing how HTS ultimately treats its minorities, how it chooses to govern in terms of issues relating to gender, and how it treats the Alawi minority that supported the Assad regime for years are all going to be, I think, indicators of how the international community might react to Syria's new government.
100%. Yeah, I agree. Just one, I have seen positive developments with the Alawi minority in Latakia. They've been the new government has actually sent out representatives to essentially sign up or make a list of Alawi military officers who were in the army, and all they have to do is come and present themselves and show who they are, and they will be checked off as basically somebody who has surrendered and is fine, and there's, they're kind of given a new card or whatever saying that they're fine now, which is a sign of things to come, hopefully, that we'll see on that front, that there'll be some kind of a reconciliation. And I think most of the population wants to move on to past the civil war and leave that behind.
Thanks, Joel. So I think I'm going to say thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Joel, thank you for the presentation. On behalf of the Moshe Dayan Center and its leadership, we look forward to continuing the conversation with you when the next opportunity presents. And thanks again to Yael Regev and her team, Anat Yitzchaki, and to Amos Elad for opening tonight's event.
Thank you very much.